Welcome to Inside the On-the-Way Kitchen. Today we're going to be making a camp favorite, baked ziti. I've linked the recipe below so you all have access to it. Baked ziti is a simple comfort food that we all can make. If you follow these steps, you too can make camp on-the-way quality baked ziti. Let's get started. To make baked ziti, our ingredients include penne pasta, extra virgin olive oil, a pound of 80-20 ground beef, some salt and pepper, 1 large onion diced, about 4 large cloves of garlic minced, 2 tablespoons of basil and a tablespoon of oregano, a large can of crushed tomatoes, a large can of diced tomatoes, 8 ounces of mozzarella cheese, and a container of ricotta cheese, about 1.5 cups worth. All right, to get started, we're going to start with making the pasta first. So I've got a pot of hot water on the back. I'll get that fired up, and while that is heating up, we're going to start working on the sauce. Once the noodles are done, what we're going to do is we'll drain them in a colander, toss just a little bit of olive oil on them, not very much. Too much and your sauce tends not to stick to your noodles very well. But we'll toss it with just a little olive oil so they don't stick together, and then we'll use them in a future step. So while that's heating up, we're going to get the sauce started. We're going to start by getting a small amount, say a tablespoon or 2, of extra virgin olive oil into the pan, and while that is then heating up until it's at a pretty good shimmer, once that happens, then we'll get our ground beef into the pan. All right, our oil is just starting to shimmer now, so it's plenty hot. So when we get the ground beef put into it, she'll sizzle pretty well, but the purpose of that is so it doesn't stick to the bottom. All I'm doing here is breaking up the ground beef into smaller pieces so that as it's in the pan, bring that down to medium high, as it's in the pan here, it'll be easier for it to brown up. So just get it into smaller pieces. And then I'm going to add some salt and pepper to it. Pretty generous amounts. We're not going to put a ton of extra salt and pepper into our recipe, so a lot of this is going to be to season this meat as it is cooking on the stove top, and then we'll have seasoned browned ground beef to be adding to our sauce later on. I'm just stirring this in to distribute that salt and pepper we just added. Finish breaking up those pieces. I'm going to let that brown. Now, I'll stir it every once in a while. It tends to be a little easier to brown it up if you don't stir constantly, simply because this way you're actually getting that to cook versus constantly in the move, and you don't know if some of those pieces have gotten thoroughly cooked through. All right, our ground beef is finished cooking through. And what we're going to take, or what we're going to do now, is we're going to take the ground beef off of the stove. So I'm turning the burner off. I'm going to bring it over and I'm going to drain the grease that has come from browning that beef. Some people would prefer to use that grease for browning the onions and the garlic that's coming, but there's just entirely too much there. So just like we do at camp, we drain all the grease off. This is just the way that we cook it through. So I'll be right back with our drained ground beef. Alright, I'm back with our drained ground beef. As you can see, I got all the extra oil that was in there out of there. I drained it into a different can, and then this way when that oil cools or solidifies, I can just get rid of it without having to put it down the drain, etc. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to put this ground beef, this browned ground beef, into another bowl and set it off to the side, because we're going to add this to our sauce. But we need to saute the onions and the garlic and add the tomatoes and all that before we get the meat back into it. Alright, so I put that ground beef into another bowl. I'm going to set that off to the side so that we can get our sauce started. I'm going to start by, once again, I'm going to use that same pan that I used to brown the ground beef in. We're just going to put the sauce into that same pan. I'm going to start by just a little bit of olive oil, a tablespoon or two. Get that heated up. Now the pan's already hot, so it's going to heat up faster than it did the first time. So just kind of move that around, get that oil distributed, and then once this is hot and ready to go, once it's shimmering, I'm going to get the onions and the garlic in. And so our oil is getting nice and hot. You can even, the little bits of the ground beef that are in there, it's already starting to sizzle on those. So I'm going to dump in my diced up one large onion. That all moved around. That in. Turn that heat down to medium high. Add a little bit of salt. And some pepper to it. Now we're going to cook the onion first without adding in the garlic, because the onion's going to take a little longer than the garlic is. So I'm going to get that onion softening up. Spread it out. Now, while that's working, over on the side here, I don't know if you can see it in the video, but our water is coming up to a boil. So what I'm going to do is, while that is sauteing, and before we get the garlic into it, I'm going to get the noodles put into the back pot so that they can start to cook while the sauce is doing its thing. So let's see. Yep, there's a good boil going on in the back. That's on high. Now I'm going to add in our noodles to that back pot. Now, I don't want to cover it once I put the noodles in. If you do, you're going to end up with a boil over, and we don't want one of those. So there's a box of noodles that's just about a pound. Give that a quick stir so they don't stick together. We're going to let that cook. Now, if you look at our onions, the onions are sauteing up nicely. They're getting soft. Little brown bits coming off the bottom from the leftover ground beef that was in there. Smells wonderful. Love the smell of cooking onion. So now we're going to get our 4 cloves of garlic put in there. I just took 4 cloves of garlic, smashed them with my chef's knife so that the peelings come off of it, and then cut off the little tips, and then minced it up. Now you can buy minced garlic, that's fine, it doesn't have to be whole bulb garlic. At camp, we get a whole peeled garlic by these giant containers. And then what we do is we mince that up in our food processor so that when we go to make food throughout the day, we automatically have it ready to go instead of having to hand chop or chop per meal. This way it's more efficient for us. We're gonna give that about a minute, and then we'll come back. All right, so it's been a minute or so, and our onions are to the point of being translucent or kind of see-through, and things are just starting to brown up, which is just where we want it to be. So what we're going to do, we're going to take our spices. That's the 2 tablespoons of basil and the tablespoon of oregano, and we're going to add that in right away. Get that mixed in, get those onions and garlic coated on there. Let's get those oils from the vegetables, oils that are in the seasonings, get those incorporated, worked in together, and just give that about a minute. You don't want it to burn. That's a big no-no. Next thing that we're going to do, once these have had a chance to work their magic, is we're going to add in our tomatoes. And that's our crushed tomatoes and our diced. Okay, so it's been about a minute. Those have had time to work together. Smells wonderful. Let's get those tomatoes in. First, I've got my can of crushed tomatoes. Get that work in. And I've got my can of diced. Now, I put the diced tomatoes in this bowl because I used the can from the diced tomatoes to drain my ground beef. That's why this is in a bowl. We're going to get those mixed together so that the onions and the spices and the garlic and the 2 different forms of tomatoes get mixed together well. And then what we're going to do is we're going to put the lid on this. We're going to let this simmer just a little bit so that this is going to heat up. And then we can get our beef put into it, and we're going to let that cook through next. While that's doing its thing, make sure that we're stirring our noodles. Now, if you've got an enormous pot, you'll notice that the noodles will start to stick to the bottom if you don't get down and actually get those stirred up well. In the on-away kitchen, we have huge pots because we're making food for anywhere between, say, 60 and 200 people each meal. So our pots would be almost as tall as the stove up to the hood here. But for at home, you don't have to worry about that. Just make sure that you stir your noodles. You don't want to overcook them. You don't want them to be too soft. You want to get them to a point of al dente where they're just edible. They're not hard and crunchy, but they're not mushy either. We've still got a couple minutes on the noodles. As you can see through here, we're starting to get some bubbles here in our sauce already. And that means that our sauce is starting to get heated through. And that's good. I don't know if you can see all of the great spices that are in there. It's got some good color to it. We've obviously not underspiced this by any means. And while this is already starting to bubble, I'm going to get that beef and put it back in so that the beef will heat up. The flavors of the beef and the tomatoes and the onions and all that will start to meld together. So here's our beef. Put that in. Get all those little bits in there. Everybody likes a meaty ziti sauce. Now, if you want to make this without meat, that's perfectly fine. We usually do a vegetable or a vegetarian option for camp each of the weeks that we serve this. not everybody is a meat eater. Some people are gluten-free, so we'll end up with, instead of using the standard penne noodles that you see boiling over here, we're going to use gluten-free noodles. Or if you're dairy-free, maybe you have an allergy or you're just trying to stay away from dairy, it's fine. The cheese that we put into this later on, you'll just get to skip that step. So for right now, we're going to let the sauce simmer and work its way through and get really tasty. So I'm going to cover it up, let it do its thing. I'm going to check our noodles again to see if those are pretty close. Just by the feel of them, I can tell they need a couple more minutes still. It's been a couple more minutes, and in that time I took the opportunity to do a little bit of cleanup. Like any good chore boy or chore girl worth their salt, you try and clean as you go. So these noodles feel pretty good. They feel about al dente. So what I'm going to do is take one out. I'm going to put it down so I can make sure there's no boiling water coming out of it that's going to burn my hand, right? And just try one. Perfect. Just what I'm looking for. A little resistance to the bite still. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drain this just through my colander over in the sink, and then I'm going to put a little bit of olive oil across those drained noodles so that they don't stick together. So I've got the noodles drained, and I rinsed them off in cold water because I wanted to stop the cooking process. I'm going to put them back into my pan. Just so I have a good spot for them. Add just a touch, not much, just a touch of olive oil so that they don't stick to each other. I mean, that might be at best a tablespoon. It's definitely not more than that. Just a little bit so that these noodles don't stick to each other. Okay? Noodles are done, sauce is simmering. I'm going to turn the oven on, bring it up to 350, so that my oven is going to be hot and ready when I need it. Let's check that sauce. Looks pretty darn good. Starting to thicken up a bit, and that's okay if it's a little on the thin side, because you're going to be spreading this across the pan in multiple layers. It doesn't need to be a thick, sticky sauce. Okay? If you want, you can always add some tomato paste to something like this if you like a sauce that is super thick. But what we've got here looks pretty good. Let me give that a taste test. Always use a new spoon. We go through quite a bit of this at camp simply because we want to make sure it tastes good before we assemble it and then put it into the oven. That's pretty darn good. What I'm going to do is I'm going to turn the heat off on this, and now we're going to start to move to the production phase of all of this and putting the ziti together and making those wonderful layers. So what we're going to do now is we're going to move to the assembly stage of making our ziti. So we've got our sauce here, we've got our noodles here. Both of those are going to go in, but we have to start by spraying the pans. If you don't, you're going to have a scrubbing job when dinner is all done. If you have ever been a chore boy up at camp and you have been on the inside position, the inside job, the person whose job it is to get all the crud scrubbed out of what we make, you will appreciate anybody who sprays your pans well. So we have a sprayed pan, a little cooking oil on there, it's fine. We're going to put some of the sauce in the bottom to start with, then we're going to layer noodles, then we're going to layer both of our cheeses, and we're going to repeat, and we'll get the last of the sauce across the top with some cheese, and then we'll put it in the oven. We're going to bake it for about 20 minutes. So let's see how this goes. We're going to begin by taking our ladle and taking some of that sauce that we put together and then put it into the bottom of the pan. Okay, so get a good amount of that in here. Get that spread around. You don't want it swimming. You definitely don't want a great deal in here, but just enough to cover the bottom. We have plenty of sauce, so it's not like we have to worry about skimping, but we also don't need a giant mess. Next, we're going to move to the noodles. Take the lid off that. Not like it's holding any heat in. These are all cold. Okay. So what we're going to do is we'll take some of the noodles then. Just use our spoon here. We're going to put a layer of noodles. And we're going to do 2 layers, so we don't need it to be overwhelming, but enough to cover the bottom. Now, one of the hallmarks or things that we are famous for at camp is that our baked ziti is incredibly cheesy. If you just heard that, that means our oven is up to temp. So when we're done here, we're going to be able to just slide it right into there, and we'll be all set for dinner. Next, we're going to get the cheese on. I'm going to start with ricotta. Now, for today, I'm going to use a spoon, just because we're not using a great deal of it. But at camp, we get this in 3 or 5 pound tubs, and we're making enormous pans, and we're making 5 or 6 of them. So then we'll glove up, and it's easier to put on with your hands. So ricotta cheese is a real watery, thin cheese. It's not a dry cheese like we're going to get with the mozzarella. So what you want to do is you're going to put little globs of it all over. Ricotta's got a real mild flavor to it. When we make these at camp, this is probably the most requested job that the kids, when we're baking these up, that the kids want to do. They want to be able to get their hands in and really control this part of the process. One of their favorite things to do. I myself tend to be in the background for a lot of this because there's just too many hands kind of ruin the soup. You get in everybody's way, and the kids really do enjoy making the zitis. Okay, you can spread them out if it's nice and thin. If your ricotta is really cold, it'll stick together more in the blobs, and it doesn't spread as well. So it's quite all right to not spread it. It'll spread on its own when it gets into the oven, because it really starts to thin out. And we're going to call that good for this round. Next, we're going to get on our mozzarella cheese. I like to use kind of the non-low-fat stuff when we cook. The thing you just tend to get better flavor. We're just going to sprinkle this across. We get a ton of cheese donated by Sargento at camp. So we always use high quality mozzarella and cheddar cheeses in our recipe. So we're not getting anything that is of low quality. The stuff we get from them is wonderful. Most of the beef we get comes from Birchwood beef down in Kenosha. So we get a really high quality beef that we are using to make all of our recipes that require beef. And then any of our vegetables that we get in, we either get sourced from Reinhardt Food Service, or we get it right down the road from camp, and we get fresh local vegetables from Turner's Market in Wapaka. So that's our first layer. Next, we're going to repeat. We're going to put on another layer of our sauce. And spread that out as you go. We're going to have a nice full pan. I am by no means filling this pan with sauce. We still have another layer of noodles to go. But that covered up our cheese pretty well. I think that looks good. Put the rest of these noodles on. Get them spread out. We're going to top this with cheese, a little bit of sauce, and then we're all done. Now if you have more noodles, that's great. Fill it in. Make sure that you are getting as much into your pan as you can. You don't want it to overflow. Trust me, when this thing heats up in the oven, you really do start to get some bubbling going on, and you can make a pretty good mess if you have too much in there. But this actually looks pretty good. I'm going to call that good. Get my last layer of mozzarella cheese put in. That all spread around. And this is looking pretty much like a finished on-a-way baked ziti. Now, if you'd like to put on some Parmesan cheese at this point, feel free. You can add some extra sauce to it if you don't think you added enough in there. And you can always put some more sauce across the top. Make sure that you have a nice moist ziti. If it's really dry, you're not going to be or not have a whole lot of happy campers on your hands. So, until we get this in the oven, which will be pretty much right now, this is what a finished, prepped baked ziti will look like. Now it's time to get in the oven. Open her up. She's been preheated to 350 degrees. Grab my oven mitts. Get her slid into the middle rack. Close her up. And in 20 minutes, we're going to have a finished baked ziti. One that will be camp quality and taste just like you're there. Well, I checked it at 20 minutes and I could still use a little bit of time. So I gave it another 10, and let's see what she looks like now. Ooh, it looks perfect. You can see already it's starting to bubble. The cheese is starting to brown. So what we're going to do is we're going to let it sit out and rest for 5 or 10 minutes before we cut into it and take a look at just all that yumminess. While it's resting, if you're interested, at camp we always serve this recipe with breadsticks. And of the few things that we make at camp that aren't from scratch, breadsticks is one of them. And these garlic breadsticks are essentially the same thing that we would buy in bulk in a giant case of 275 of them that you can get at your local grocery store. What we do is we pull them out, put them on a tray at the beginning of prep. They only take 5 or so minutes in the oven, so we don't put them in frozen solid. They're slightly thawed. And then you have pretty much the same meal. So if you're interested, they are just New York style or New York brand breadsticks. So it's had the chance to sit and cool for a little while. So if you peel back, notice it's not sticking. That's all because we sprayed the pan, and our inside person at camp is going to be happy. But when you dig through, you're going to find that this is a wonderfully melty, cheesy dish that everyone, including your favorite people from camp, are going to love and enjoy. The recipe feeds between 7 and 8 people if you eat sizable portions. Otherwise, this pan could easily feed way more than that, especially if you have little kids. This is probably going to be a family favorite within your household. I know it is at camp, and I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial on how to make baked ziti on-a-way style. If you have any other camp favorite recipes that you'd like to see, please let me know, and I'll do my best to try and make up a tutorial so you can make some of these camp favorites at home. Hopefully next summer when you get back to Camp Onaway for a whole week, you won't have missed the food all that bad because you've had a chance to make some of these wonderful recipes at home. Brigade is offering a lot of great opportunities through their Save Our Summer program to get yourself up to camp for a day, or to do some activities like tubing on Bago or shooting in the rifle range at the building in downtown Neenah. If you have any questions, please reach out to Brigade at 920-725-3983. Otherwise, this has been Inside the Onaway Kitchen. Have a great day.